Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and I'm going to share with you guys a fact about the NBA that you might not be aware of. As of the release of this video, it's been 147 days since an NBA trade has occurred. No salary dumps, no pick swaps, no contenders trading for role players or teams selling off veterans in an effort to tank, nothing. The last trade we got was all the way back in July, which notably was a big one, the Russell Westbrook and Chris Paul swap, but still it's just strange how long it's been since any NBA team has made a deal. And at this point you might be thinking that it's only just over a quarter of the way through the season, so you can't really expect there to be many trades at this point. But by this time last year, we had the Jimmy Butler trade to the Sixers, Kyle Korver being sent to the Jazz, George Hill to the Bucks, and a little bit later on in December, we got Kelly Oubre to Phoenix. So it was an active trade market last year to this point, and not so much so far this year. And this is a pretty big issue because for me and for a lot of other people, I'm sure, a big draw for watching the NBA and for being invested in it is the player movement and the trades and how the league can change so quickly, and that's just not happening right now. And this is especially true in a season in which one of the more dominant headlines has been the fact that ratings are down and there just doesn't seem to be as much interest in this season for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that maintains interest through this part of the season as well as on through February while football is still going on is trades and player movement. So if those things aren't happening, then fan interest is going to continue to decrease until we get to the playoffs. Now, it's not quite the end of the world and things can always turn around. There can always be more trades. Heck, it could be a couple of days after I make this video, the first couple of trades happen and this video makes absolutely no sense anymore. But it's still worth looking into why exactly there just hasn't been very much movement at all to this point in the NBA season. So that's what we're going to be doing today, going over some general as well as some specific reasons for why exactly no teams across the NBA have made a trade since all the way back in July. Well, the first thing is there's a lot of above average to really good teams across the NBA right now that don't really want to mess with the chemistry that they have while they're still rolling. There's 9 teams across the league that have won over 2/3 of their games, and they probably don't want to mess with their current roster construction by making a deal. Like, you have your teams that are doing extremely well record-wise, like the Lakers and the Bucks, but then there's other teams like the Clippers and the Celtics and the Heat and the Rockets that don't really see a need to make a move right now because in terms of the standings, they're doing just fine and they're just a couple of games outside of being one of the top seeds across the league, but maybe later on in the season, they'll be looking to make a move. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, there's still a lot of teams across the league that do have playoff hopes. Things are pretty wide open at the back end of both conferences in terms of the playoff standings, and there's just not a lot of teams that are looking to sell off their pieces right now. And that's in pretty sharp contrast to last year, in which a good amount of teams went into the season knowing that they weren't going to be very good in an effort to tank and try and be a really good free agency destination with all their salary cap space and then get another high draft pick. There certainly are some teams that came into this season knowing they weren't going to be very good, but there's not as many of them, and a lot of the teams are realistically trying to push for that 7th or 8th seed in the playoffs. And then the other part of that, like I said, is there's no big free agency sweepstakes this offseason. Last offseason, we saw all these different guys change teams, and this year, there's just not going to be very many notable free agents at all, so there aren't as many salary dump maneuvers, there's not as many teams trying to manipulate their payroll to be in a really good situation at free agency, so there's just not a lot of incentive on either the teams that are good trying to make a move to add a role player, or teams at the bottom of the conferences trying to sell off pieces to help them tank, or in any other circumstance in terms of free agency, there's just not a lot of incentive to make a move right now. And again, in sharp contrast to last year, there's not that one top tier team like the Warriors were during the season, even though record-wise they weren't playing as well as the Lakers and the Bucks are right now. From a talent perspective, everybody knew that it was the Golden State Warriors that you had to go through, so there were plenty of teams that were aggressively trying to make moves to try and contend against those guys as much as possible. But now we're in a bit more of an unknown situation where teams don't feel like they have to push right away, and they can kind of wait and see because there's still time to catch up to the teams at the top of the conferences. And in the postseason, they don't know exactly what they're going to be running into with all these different players having changed teams, so they're more willing to just kind of wait and see. But it's not just about the incentive and the motive to make the moves, it's also about the ability to, because as you look at most NBA rosters, teams are getting smarter about the contracts that they're handing out to their non-star or superstar players. Many teams like the Rockets and the Celtics would like to make moves right now, but 70% of their payroll is made up by just a couple of players at the top of their rosters, and the other players on their roster are on movable contracts, but they're not guys that they would feel comfortable moving. Now, this is a different situation than we've typically seen because with the cap spike in 2016 and all the craziness that came out of that, there were a lot of teams that were carrying role players with massive contracts, which made it easier to swap those contracts with other players when you're getting it in exchange for a star or when you're trying to dump that salary and you're attaching picks. There was a lot more maneuvering going on because of those bad contracts, but now teams are getting smarter, as I said, and they're allocating a lot of their resources to one or two players whose contracts are almost completely immovable, even if they wanted to, and then the rest of the roster are really important players to their team that they wouldn't really want to move because they're important pieces, even though they're the most movable contracts. For example, when you look at the Rockets, you've got James Harden, you've got Russell Westbrook. After that, you've got guys like Clint Capella, who I doubt they would move because he's a perfect fit for their system. And then you're looking at PJ Tucker and Daniel House, and just not a ton of options in terms of salary matching for another good player. And it's a similar situation for the Celtics, which we've known for a while when they were potentially looking at trading for Anthony Davis or any number of stars. They would have to include Gordon Hayward in any kind of deal, which I think they would be hesitant to do, given the fact that he did play much better to begin this season, his connection with Brad Stevens. So contract-wise as well, it's not just the motive and the incentive, it's more difficult to make trades right now as well in terms of making the money work. That's not to say that there aren't teams that can make moves. You've got Portland, you've got Miami. Those teams have some big expiring contracts on their roster, which would help them bring in a player like Kevin Love, potentially, who's one of the most notable trade target names out there right now. But most teams don't have those big expiring contracts anymore because, again, they're getting smarter about how they're signing their role players. And so, as most of these points have said, there's just not a ton of buyers or sellers on the trade market right now. And maybe last season was just an exception to have so many early season moves, but it's still strange for it to be almost 150 days now since we've had any kind of move across the NBA. And maybe things will start to heat up as we get closer to the trade deadline, as things start to solidify a little bit in the standings and teams realize they're actually a contender or they're not. Teams start to slide even further down the standings. They want to sell off pieces. There's definitely teams around the league that have pieces to trade away. It just kind of is all going to depend on timing and incentive the closer we get to the trade deadline. And also, when you're thinking about potential trades, there's not as many big names out there because half of the big names just changed teams last off season, and so these would be smaller moves. Potentially the Pelicans looking to trade away JJ Redick because they're not a contending team. He wants to be on a contender. They could get some value out of him because they're not where they want to be right now. The Knicks certainly, as I talked about in a recent video, have plenty of veterans that they could trade away, but the bigger names you're probably going to see here are maybe Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond if the Pistons really crater and they want to move some pieces. And then Kevin Love is the other big one because right now I just don't see any other big pieces that could be potentially moved, which is upsetting for me and disappointing because that's one of the things that I love the most about the NBA is the trade speculation, talking about where these guys could go, and then just how much the league can change with one or two trades and the possibility of a team going from kind of a contender to a legit real deal threat to win it all just with one or two moves. So again, not all hope is lost. Portland and Miami can still make some moves. Maybe Boston and Houston can get really creative. The Sixers, teams like that could get really creative with different moves that they could make in 3-team or 4-team deals. But right now, there's a reason things are pretty quiet on the trade front. The Spurs stuff has calmed down a little bit with the DeMar DeRozan and potential LaMarcus Aldridge movement as well. There's just not a lot of opportunities out there. Hopefully it picks up. I'm really hoping it does because, again, that's what I love about the NBA, and I think there are opportunities, but we might only see like 4 or 5 significant trades before the deadline because there's just not a lot of reasons to be making those moves right now. And hey, maybe we'll get to the trade deadline and someone will watch this video and be like, Tucker, what are you talking about? There's all these different moves, there's all this craziness, all this stuff is going on. That could absolutely happen. Things can change overnight in the NBA, we know that, but unfortunately and disappointingly, as I said, right now it just doesn't look like that is going to be the case. If you have potential trades, potential trade partners, players you think could possibly be traded, you have trade ideas, then be sure as always to leave those down in the comments section below for future trade machines or just other videos in general. Be sure to leave those down in the comment section below. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.